For the history of the world in one country, I'd pick Taiwan. It was both connected to and emblematic of great power politics and global capitalist development for the past 120 years. Like most of the world, Taiwan entered the 20th century as a colony. It was exceptional only insofar as it was a part of the Japanese Empire, a new Pan-Asian order meant to fend off the West. After the Meiji Revolution, Japan had militarized so fast and effectively that in 1895 it defeated China, absorbing Taiwan in the process, and a decade later it defeated Russia. Japan's failed bid for hegemony defined the early 20th century in the Pacific. Under the policy of industrial Japan, agricultural Taiwan, the empire engineered a shift from subsistence to export agriculture. 16% of Japan's rice and more than 80% of its sugar came from Taiwan, as the percentage of irrigated farmland doubled. Before Japan arrived, Taiwan had almost no roads, railways, or financial institutions, and less than 10% of children were in school. By the 1940s, Japan had connected the northern and southern ports by railway, built over 12,000 kilometers of roads, opened more than 400 banks, and increased primary school enrollment to over 70%. Land surveys clarified property rights, formalized landlord-tenant relations, and facilitated rural taxation. Thus, colonial modernization gave Taiwan a powerful centralized state that penetrated the countryside and a relatively large endowment of human capital. As the conclusion of World War II brought many nations around the world independence, Taiwan underwent a complex political transition from Japanese to Chinese rule, a process of decolonization that felt pretty colonial to most islanders. Even as many cheered the expulsion of the Japanese and welcomed the Kuomintang from the mainland, they soon became disillusioned by corruption, military dictatorship, and economic stagnation. Inflation soared to over 3,000%. In response to widespread protests against police violence, the KMT rounded up and shot nearly 20,000 Taiwanese, effectively liquidating most of the island's intellectual and social elite. When, 2 years later, the civil war for control of mainland China ended in CCP victory, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan and initiated a massive population transfer. Between 1 and 2 million mainlanders crowded in next to the 6 million Taiwanese already living on the island. Refugees included Shanghai capitalists, engineers, and managers, who brought with them highly valuable skill sets and organizational practices, in short, new elites subordinate to the KMT. As in many settler colonial states, tensions between these two identity groups were central to Taiwanese politics for the rest of the century. In his book on how the short 20th century is defined by the contest between the US and the USSR, Hobsbawm says, parenthetically, that in fact, the standout characteristic of the 20th century was the agrarian transition. Quote, compared to this, the history of the confrontation between capitalism and socialism will probably seem more like 16th and 17th century wars of religion. For Taiwan, the Cold War and the agrarian transition were not separable, however. To even exist in the first place, the KMT state had to rely on American security and finance. Between 1949 and 1968, Taiwan became the biggest per capita recipient of American military aid. The KMT received nearly $4.2 billion, over 80% of which went to the Army. This, plus the 7th Fleet patrolling the Taiwan Strait, ensured that Chiang Kai-shek maintained his state. The remaining U.S. aid went to farmers, financing nearly two-thirds of agrarian capital formation. Agricultural exports were the main method for acquiring the foreign currency necessary to finance industrialization. The KMT was well aware that its failed rural policies had cost it the mainland and could possibly cost it Taiwan if communists managed to infiltrate the island. Fortunately, the party's ideology supported equal access to land resources, as detailed by its founder Sun Yat-sen, one of the first theorists of development outside Europe. And America encouraged land reform. So, in 1953, the majority of Taiwan's farm households became owner-cultivators, laying the foundation for a more equitable pattern of development. Indeed, Taiwan's income distribution was among the most equal in the world, a record it still maintains today. In that sense, not only is Taiwan the true China, it's also the true communist China. Taiwan was the first late industrializer. Already by the early 1960s, Taiwan was more successful than South Korea in this regard, and to that extent it became the normative ideal of the East Asian developmental state. In part, this was accomplished by an incredibly high savings rate, over 40% of GDP. Basic education expanded, and literacy rates rose from under 30% to more than 80% by 1970. Further, the military dictatorship was able to repress consumption and wages and coordinate assistance to strategic industries with forwards and backwards linkages, which made the export sector highly competitive. By the 1980s, Taiwan had climbed high enough up the value chain that it was nearly a core country itself. After the Sino-Soviet split, détente, and the aging of the Qing dynasty, wealthy Taiwanese felt confident enough to express dissent that activists formed the Democratic Progressive Party. In the late 1980s, Taiwan democratized. 1986 was the height of Taiwanese industrialization, when manufacturing value-added accounted for 37% of GDP, making it an industrial society par excellence. Deindustrialization in the 1990s hit hard, but with the chaotic rise of the PRC in the last 2 decades, Taiwan has reindustrialized. On the cutting edge of this was Foxconn, the notorious subcontracting company that had to put nets on its factories in Shenzhen to prevent employee suicide. Another, more important Formosan champion was Taiwan Semi, the pioneer of the so-called foundry model, making microchips that others design. Today, it makes half of all microchips in the world. It's a rare digital device that doesn't have Taiwan Semi somewhere inside it. And it's this development that I would argue turns Taiwan from merely representative or emblematic of world history to one of its central determinants. It's once again on the front line of global capitalist development and great power politics, as revanchist mainland nationalism shadowboxes with the American empire over the status of democracy on this little island.